will invite our next speakers on. So we have Cami is here. Great, thanks. Cami's getting her slides already. So our next presentation, Engaging in Ethical Partnerships for Sustainable Education Reform, is delivered by Cami Hazlewood. Cami is joined by Pip Henderson from Flinders University. Unfortunately, Dr. Sara Weuffen from UNSW isn't able to be here today, but is working collaboratively together with Cami and Pip. So Cami Hazlewood is a non-Indigenous PhD candidate here at QUT and a former primary teacher with highly accomplished and lead teacher certification. Her research examines Indigenous education policy and migrant teacher identity. Pip Henderson is a non-Indigenous researcher whose work spans education, public health and sport, including community-led sport for development projects, curriculum reviews and Indigenous. Dr. Sara Weuffen specialises in educational research, cross-cultural studies, diversity and inclusion. So working on Wada Wurrung country, she leads multidisciplinary teams focused on advancing culturally respectful and responsive pedagogy. So please join me in welcoming Cami Hazlewood and Pip Henderson with us. Thank you. Over to you guys.
Okay. Now, I apologize. I don't know how to get it to full screen without losing all of my notes. So hopefully that's okay. Unless, Natasha, you want to share my presentation.
No, it all looks good, Cami. Let's go.
It's all right. Okay, cool. Well, yes, as you know, Sara unfortunately can't join us today, but I will be sharing today with Pip. And yes, you know our title of our presentation. So the default setting is that partnerships with Indigenous people is optional for us because of our membership with the dominating knowledge power group. Ethical behavior means that recognizing that it's not optional for Indigenous people. We're non-Indigenous researchers and educators, and what we are wrestling with is how to not be extractive and to not speak for Indigenous people. In this presentation, we're talking to other non-Indigenous researchers and educators. Pip and I will present our standpoint and experience of working in Indigenous education in our own presentations. We will also utilize the Australian Institute of Teaching and School Leadership Indigenous Cultural Responsiveness Capability Framework to guide our reflection on how we, as non-Indigenous teachers and researchers, can use this guide in a way that is ethical. Each of our presentations will include a reflection on ethical ways of knowing, being, and doing for non-Indigenous educators and researchers. Sorry, there we go. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which we are presenting today, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples and the Kaurna peoples. Their sovereignty was never ceded. We recognize the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today and all Indigenous peoples from across the world who have joined us. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us as we work to improve the practice of Indigenous education. Over to you, Pip.
Thank you. Can I just check that my microphone's working? I've had all sorts of fun with it today. Is it working okay? Oh, yep. Thank you. Thanks, Natasha. I see the thumbs up. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Pip. As Cami and Natasha introduced me earlier, I identify as a white person. I'm a cisgender woman. I'm a mother of 3 children, and they're enrolled across both primary school and secondary schools here on Kaurna Yerta. I'm a researcher at Flinders Uni, and I actually work in the College of Medicine and Public Health. And so when people hear me talking about education, sometimes I get a bit of a quizzical look around, well, what are you doing talking about education if you're actually public health? But of course, you know, education is a social determinant of health, and I see education as being a key public health issue. So my PhD focuses on the current teaching workforce's capacity to provide culturally responsive education to young people in schools, with a particular focus on sociocultural and socio-political consciousness. And it was this study that actually brought me into relationships with Cami and Sara, who obviously is not here with us today. Please forgive me for this next little bit. I will be reading a lot because this is one of the parts that wasn't on my agenda for this day, but I'm really happy to share this bit because I think it's really key to setting the context for this whole presentation and lots of conversations around how non-Indigenous teachers can engage in ethical practices in the education system. So before I start, I think it's really important to recognise that sophisticated systems of education that are experiential, practical and culturally grounded, they've existed way beyond in this country that's now called Australia, now known as Australia. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been doing education since time immemorial, well before colonisation happened here. But colonisation has brought to this country that we call Australia a system of education from England that we recognise now. We still see the remnants of it in the classrooms and the curriculum that young people attend or are exposed to today as part of their formal education. So teachers and school leaders, because of this compulsory nature in particular, they serve a vital role in society. So we see them as educators, but we also see them as mentors and experts and role models for future generations. And they have the power to impact young people. They have the power to sort of set expectations and set the tone in classrooms and provide a learning experience that provides every student with an opportunity to engage in a quality education. So one thing that's really important to know, and this is something that we really want to make sure that educators recognise, is that cultural responsiveness is not about adding more to the demands of teachers. Teachers are always telling us, that they're overburdened, there's a lot of paperwork, they're very busy. And so culturally responsive is not about doing more, it's about enhancing the experiences, it's about enhancing teacher practices, it's about recognising the cultural assets of a diverse student cohort, right? It's about making sure that it's not just this monocultural approach to education. So ATSL, which is, I never get this right the first time, it's the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership. ATSL, it's a peak body here in Australia, and they've developed a capability framework, and that defines the knowledges, skills and behaviours that are required to improve or enhance the knowledge with regard to teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and applies to teaching in a range of contexts. So obviously within Australia, we've got a really broad geographical landscape, but we've also got a range of school sectors. For example, we've got a government public sector as well as an independent private sector as well. So this capability framework sets up guiding values and principles, as well as steps that teachers can take to move between. And you can see the Cammy's got on the screen for us. You can see it's actually a continuum. So it's not this, it is a stage progression. That's not to say that it's entirely linear all the time, but it is a really valuable way of sort of conceptualizing, obviously stage 1 and stage 2 are unsatisfactory for teachers. Stage 3 is sort of bare minimum. We want to be looking at cultural competence and cultural responsivity, eventually with the end game, the end goal to have culturally sustainable education. So one of the things that ATSL actually did when they published this was introduced a self-reflection tool, and that actually helps teachers it guides them into a self-reflexivity opportunity. So it gives them an opportunity to have a look, respond to some questions and see where they're kind of landing. And for some teachers, this can be sort of affirming, yep, cool, I'm on the right track. And others, it might be a bit of an eye-opener for them to be able to see, oh, okay, maybe I've got some work to do in this space. And that sort of leads us to this idea that ATSL provides these tips into action that sort of help encourage people towards engaging in more culturally responsive practices. So our presentation is going to speak to the stages 4, 5 and 6 with regard to competence, cultural responsiveness and cultural sustainability. So I'm going to move on to that section next. Cammy, if you want to, that's it, perfect. And I think it's really interesting. I haven't managed to speak to a lot of the presentations today, but I did get to hear right at the end, I think it was Salisa's talk around citing First Nations people. And I think that that's a really, really valuable thing that comes into play with some of the things that we talk about doing in this presentation as well. With regard to competence, so competence is, we think about competence, take the cultural element out and just think about competence. We can understand very clearly it's around skills, knowledge, attitudes, etc. But when expressed through behaviours and actions, they provide some evidence to determine whether someone is competent or not in a particular area. When we extend this to cultural competence, we're not thinking about this just in, a cross-cultural situation, which obviously it is, but there's additional elements that are underpinned by cultural awareness and cultural safety. That takes me back to that continuum, showing that it actually has a level of progression, even though it's not always linear. So in thinking around cultural competence, I think 2 key things are around, when we talk about knowing, being and doing, we understand that competence has these elements of affective, cognitive and behavioural. So those match up really nicely. And when we think about the knowing part, I think it's really for non-Indigenous people or white people, I guess it depends on your context. Unlearning and relearning are just simply vital in this space. So unlearning is all those things around uninvisibilizing the unchecked, unchallenged, invisible. And I put invisible in scare quotes there because it's not invisible. Whiteness and power and privilege afforded to dominant majorities are not entirely visible. It's usually if you're the benefactor of those, then it's invisible, but it's not otherwise. And so that's why I often talk about invisible like this. And so the learning part of knowing, if once we've done the unlearning, then we have space to do the relearning. And if the relearning is then informed by counter stories and counter narratives to the majoritarian stories, then we're disrupting that source of information that always was sort of monocultural, like I was talking about before with the curriculum. And it provides the opportunity to critically interrogate what we're getting, what we're being fed as our evidence or as our sources of truth, for example. Moving on to that being element. So I highly recommend Tuck and Yang's work on decolonization is not a metaphor. Settler moves to innocence is something that I think is a really good place for non-Indigenous white scholars to grapple with. I think that, again, same with that reflexivity tool that ATSL provides, the settler moves to innocence, the document there, the article there that Tuck and Yang offer us actually gives us an opportunity to sort of see if we recognise ourselves in any of the actions. And if we are, then we're probably not engaging in culturally competent ways. So it's really about making sure that we're not deflecting or shifting blame away due to that cognitive dissonance or that discomfort that we can feel sometimes as members of the dominant majority when we're confronted with some truth telling. So part of that is about embracing feedback. And one of the things that I think is really valuable learning in this space is that critical feedback from Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people should probably be viewed as an act of love. So being growled at is not necessarily a punitive endeavour. It's about being educated, right? If an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person calls me out for something that I've done, what it's telling me is that they see that I've made a mistake. They're sharing with me that I've made the mistake. They're providing me an opportunity to do better rather than just sort of dismissing me. I have an opportunity. So when we're provided with that feedback, let's listen. Two ears, one mouth. So let's listen more than we speak in that space. And then lastly, the doing part. So the doing part is, I think, interesting because sometimes it's about what we're not doing. So that time when we're not stepping into the space, that time that we're not taking the spotlight, the time that we're not doing a project in the way that we had originally planned, even though institutional ethics gave us, if the community gave us approval for it, I should say, if the community is telling us no, then it's a no, okay? Even if technically, institutional ethics says that we've got this. So it's about what you're not doing as well. And in that way, it sort of really leads into the part about being responsive. So I'm going to hand over to you, Hammy, because you're going to talk about cultural responsivity.
Thanks, Pip. Okay, so I just wanted to share, I'm non-Indigenous American Australian student researcher. After I completed my Master of Education in First Nations education in 2023, I started working as an academic in Indigenous education units for pre-service and practicing teachers. And my research is focusing on policy and practice in Indigenous education. So following on from Pip's discussion, a goal of cultural competence is to recognize the impact of culture on oneself and others. It's also to recognize the impact of culture on the systems in which we work. It's not difficult to ascertain from limited scrutiny that the Australian education system reflects Western knowledges and perspectives and marginalizes Indigenous knowledges and perspectives. The Australian education system reinforces these knowledge-power relationships. Cultural responsiveness, then, means to recognize the impact of culture on oneself and others and the system, and then to ethically respond to shift the knowledge-power dynamic, to increase Indigenous voice and representation, to affirm Indigenous identities, and to participate in collaborative relationships. The recommendation from the framework is to move toward cultural responsiveness by developing a plan for more culturally safe and welcoming learning environments, encouraging participation and contributions from families and communities, and setting up a localized list of individuals and organizations who can provide cultural authority and guidance. But given the existing knowledge power dynamics in the education system and the overwhelming majority of non-Indigenous educators and researchers of education, consideration of how ethical cultural responsiveness is enacted is vital. So for non-Indigenous peoples, it's necessary first to know how Indigenous peoples, their stories and knowledge are represented in the Western colonial education system. Beyond self-assessment, critical reflection of the education system is needed. Looking outside of your worldview means to challenge the worldview which is familiar and reinforced by the education system, including its disciplinarity, content, and pedagogical leanings. We need to provide our students with better access to knowledges and perspectives than what the curriculum actually expects. Better representation is responsive to the value that Indigenous knowledges have for environmental and societal challenges that we currently face. And Francis was talking about that this morning. We need to be working together to deal with these wicked problems. A shift needs to occur in the way that we look at Indigenous knowledges. Rather than using a Western instrumentalist lens toward Indigenous knowledges, this knowledge corpus should be understood through Indigenous ontology and epistemology. It's necessary to better understand Western knowledges and Indigenous knowledges in order to be culturally responsive as a practitioner. The caution for non-Indigenous researchers and educators here is to increase one's knowledge without adding colonial load to our Indigenous colleagues. The framework that states that being in authentic relationships is a characteristic of cultural responsiveness. When we consider authentic relationships, we recognize that there's a mutuality in power and acceptance of each other as we are. In culturally responsive relationships, this includes specifically respecting and affirming Indigenous identities. There's also a need to recognize the ongoing impacts of settler colonialism and Indigenous erasure on both ourselves and Indigenous people who we are in relationship with. The framework states that continuous expansion of knowledge is a characteristic of cultural responsiveness, and this should be considered in two ways. Firstly, accepting the equal legitimacy of Indigenous knowledges, and secondly, recognizing and understanding the fallacies of non-Indigenous knowledge systems, understanding the barriers for Indigenous peoples that are put in place by these systems through the lack of representation or deficit representation is needed. Responsive and genuine practices are done through collaborative relationships, which avoid colonial load and extraction. This is where ethical practice needs to be the benchmark. Firstly, motivations should be scrutinized to avoid a white savior mode of practice, working to change the balance of representation in the education system. Using a guide such as the IATSIS Resource Evaluation Framework to look at chosen resources through the lenses of participation, positioning, production, and critical self-reflection maintains the responsibility on non-Indigenous educators and researchers rather than shifting this task to Indigenous knowledge holders. The Resource Evaluation Framework has been developed from the IATSIS Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research, drawing on its discussion of responsibilities associated with an integrity mindset. To avoid extractive practices, recognizing and respecting knowledge ownership over knowledge authorship is needed. Knowledge must be engaged with in competent and responsive relationships at the cultural interface to avoid the practices of selecting useful knowledge to include within a non-Indigenous education system or research project. This reinforces the need to engage with Indigenous ontology and epistemology from its own perspective in authentic relationships. The next section is Sara's, which I will present on cultural sustainability. So cultural sustainability refers to the ability to preserve cultural identity and enable change to be conducted in ways that are harmonious with cultural values. In Eitzel's continuum, it's loosely defined as responsiveness that enables ongoing learning and self-reflection for understanding, interacting, and communicating, as well as improving practices and relations. As we discuss what sustainable relationships between non-Indigenous and First Nations colleagues might involve, perhaps this is the area where doing is central. This is not to say that being and knowing is complete. However, we see and operate in a world that is constantly shifting if we do the constant work of self-reflection and agentic activism. As we think about the wicked problem of non-Indigenous people working with First Nations colleagues, cultural sustainability is not only about being attuned to the general socio-political histories that shape general experiences, but also about navigating interpersonal interactions, all toward the most critical component of sustainability, shifting antiquated systems and processes. The element to overcome in relationships is the fear or grief associated with perceived loss when the work of negotiation or change is used. It's clear that an undercurrent of socio-political shame flows throughout society or institutions, demonstrated by Australia's Voice to Parliament referendum or institutional procurement policies, casual or outright racism. And there seems to be a fear that in order for First Nations peoples to succeed, non-Indigenous people need to give something up. This is perhaps one of the subtle operations of the power-knowledge relations in Australian society. So we argue that when non-Indigenous and First Nations people work together, there is net gain. If we turn again to Finlayson's working definition about cultural sustainability, to preserve and change harmoniously in ways that are integral to the cultures, we need relationally intelligent partnerships, adaptations for each unique partnership, authenticity in being, genuine want to move forward, respect for different ways of knowing, being, and doing, and ultimately, it's about care. So while this 8 Souls framework is a good framework, and we've used it for this presentation, we wanted to get more of a nuanced approach to the knowing, being, and doing of each of these parts of the framework. So for being an opt-in person, someone who is actively making the choice to do better every day, being a person with a growth mindset about vulnerability and learning adaptations. Genma is meeting and mixing of salt water from the sea and fresh water from the land. Genma is often used as a metaphor for two-way learning, being responsive and adaptive in different ways. Knowing who you are and where you come from through critical self-reflection and being able to articulate why you want to work in this space is needed. Being a comrade to First Nations people, engaging in learning and reflection, and taking responsibility for change rather than diverting this to First Nations colleagues is needed. Slowing down sometimes, stopping and thinking about what needs to change, and weaponizing your power as a non-Indigenous person to be an agentic advocate for change.
Hey, Cami, we just have 1 minute left, or a little bit over, actually. So I'll just ask you to finish up, please.
Okay, Pip, go for it.
Perfect timing, because we've just got this last little bit to invite anyone, if they'd like to carry on the conversation with us, then there's a QR code that they can check in with just there. Essentially, we just really appreciate the opportunity to have a chat about this. We understand that what we've presented is not new to some people and very familiar to others. What we're really advocating for this, and I think that when Camu said the word care, I think that's really where we're at. What we're advocating for is relationally intelligent partnerships, and that means that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should not be left to burden the load of doing that, and that non-Indigenous people have the need to step up, but also know when to step aside and when to push and when to step into our positions or not. And I think that weaponizing that whiteness as property is a really good way forward if we're thinking about good, strong camaraderie.
Yeah, perfect. And I think you're really resonating what Celise mentioned earlier in the panel. So yeah, thank you both so much for being here and presenting your amazing research. And we wish you all the best with it.